All right, so today we're going deep into this pretty intense situation. You ready for this?
Get me.
Family squatting in abandoned buildings,
Yeah.
like actually living in them, in São Paulo, Brazil.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did not see that coming.
It's kind of mind-blowing, right? We're talking about a city with a booming economy, a global powerhouse, but people are so desperate for housing that they're making homes in these like rundown, abandoned places. It's kind of a crazy contrast, right? Brazil's getting ready for the World Cup, the Olympics, all this international attention. But a huge chunk of their own population is struggling just to find a safe place to live.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That is a pretty stark contrast. So what are we looking at today to get into this?
Okay, so we got two main sources for this deep dive. First, there's this incredible YouTube video that takes us right inside one of these occupied buildings. You get to see how these families are living, hear their stories firsthand. And then we've got this in-depth article that provides a broader context, digs into the history of the housing crisis in São Paulo, the politics behind it, the whole picture.
Interesting. So like a micro and a macro view of the situation.
Exactly. And our mission today is to try to understand what's driving this phenomenon, what pushes people to these extremes, and what does their daily life actually look like inside these occupied spaces.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. Like, on the one hand, you can see how it's an act of desperation, people with nowhere else to go taking matters into their own hands. But it also seems like there's something more to it, like a statement, a form of protest.
Right. That's what we're going to try to figure out. So let's jump right in. What struck you when you first saw this video? It's pretty intense, right?
Yeah. I mean, you see these families setting up in these unfinished spaces, making it work as best they can. Kids are playing, folks are coming together to help each other out. They even set up a little laundry area. You see electricians and plumbers using their skills to make the building livable.
It's incredible, isn't it? That resourcefulness, that sense of community in the face of such adversity.
Totally. But there's this underlying tension, too. You can feel it. Like, the threat of eviction is always hanging over them.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
In the video, one family talks about the police coming in, and you can just see the fear in their eyes.
Right. Imagine living with that constant worry, never knowing if you'll have a home tomorrow.
I was thinking that exact thing, you know. It makes you think about what you do in that situation, right? How far would you go to create some stability for your family?
Yeah, really puts things in perspective.
And one of the things that really struck me from the article is that many of these occupants aren't just like unemployed or homeless folks. They're working families.
Really?
Yeah, but their wages just can't keep up with the crazy high rents in the city. There's this quote that really stuck with me. They occupy these buildings so that the little money they do earn can be used for food. It's like their whole paycheck is going to rent, leaving nothing for anything else. And that's if they can even find a place they can afford in the first place.
Right. And the alternative is often ending up in those, what are they called? The favelas.
Often controlled by gangs, lacking basic infrastructure. So you can see why occupying an abandoned building, even with the risk of eviction, might seem like a better option for some folks.
Yeah, I mean, you're weighing the risks, right? A dangerous favela versus the uncertainty of being evicted, but at least having a roof over your head for now. It's a tough choice.
It is. And the article really digs into this whole idea that the occupation movement is about more than just finding a place to sleep. It's about demanding change.
Oh, interesting. So it's a form of activism almost.
Exactly. It's about putting pressure on the authorities to address this housing crisis, to come up with some real solutions. And they're not messing around. They're not afraid to make their voices heard. There's this powerful quote from the video where one resident says, "If we have to occupy, we will occupy, because people have nowhere to go."
Wow. I mean, they're not backing down. That's a powerful statement.
Right. It makes you think about, like, what's the responsibility of the city? What's the responsibility of society as a whole to ensure that everyone has access to safe, affordable housing? It's not an easy question.
No, definitely not. Especially in a city like São Paulo, which is, constantly growing and changing. It's a complex issue.
And to understand that complexity, we've got to dig a little deeper into the work of the guy who made this video, the filmmaker, Daniel A. Rubio. He's been documenting social movements in Brazil for over 15 years.
Oh, wow. So he's got a lot of experience with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, he really does. And he's got this unique perspective on what's happening in these occupied buildings, what's driving this whole movement. So let's dive into what he has to say.
Okay, I'm ready.
So one of the things Rubio really emphasizes is that his goal with this film, Occupying Brazil, was to give a platform to those who are often ignored, those living in the shadows of Brazil's economic success story.
So he's trying to shine a light on a part of society that often gets overlooked.
Exactly. He feels like the media tends to jump on these stories when they first pop up. Sensational, it makes headlines, but then the attention fades and people move on.
Yeah, that happens all the time. Out of sight, out of mind. Right.
Right. And what Rubio is trying to do is go deeper, beyond the initial shock, to help us understand why this is happening and who these people really are.
That makes sense. It's easy to just see the headlines and form an opinion based on that, but there's always a bigger story behind it, right?
Always. And I think the video does a great job of that. It doesn't just throw facts and figures at you. It puts you right there with these families. You see their struggles, their ingenuity, their determination to build a future for themselves and their kids. It's heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, you can't help but feel for these people, but you also have to admire their resilience, their spirit.
Absolutely. And Rubio talks about how even though millions have benefited from Brazil's economic boom in recent years, there are still so many who are being left behind. We're essentially becoming like economic refugees in their own country.
Wow, that's a powerful way to put it. Economic refugees. So for them, occupying these buildings isn't just about putting a roof over their heads. It's about reclaiming a place in a society that seems to have forgotten them.
Yeah, you nailed it. It's about fighting for their right to exist in the city, to share in its prosperity. And that brings us to a really important point. The idea that these occupations are more than just about housing. They're a form of protest, a way of demanding recognition and justice.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at earlier. It's like they're saying, we refuse to be invisible. We deserve to be seen and heard.
Exactly. They're forcing the city, and the world really, to confront the reality of what's happening, the human cost of progress, of development.
So it's a challenge, right? It's like they're holding up a mirror to society, forcing us to look at ourselves and ask some tough questions.
Exactly. Like, what good is economic growth if it leaves a whole segment of the population behind? What are our priorities? How do we define progress?
Big questions, yeah.
Big questions indeed. And to get a handle on some of these big questions, let's zoom in a bit and focus on the day-to-day realities of life inside one of these occupied buildings. What really jumped out at you from the video?
Well, one thing that really struck me was how they managed to create some sense of order and structure amidst, the chaos of it all.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? Trying to establish routines and normalcy when you're living under this constant threat of being kicked out.
I mean, they've set up committees to handle different aspects of life within the building, security, maintenance, even childcare. It's like they're creating their own little society.
And, it makes you realize that secure housing is not just a roof over your head. It's a foundation for everything else. It's about stability, security, the ability to plan for the future, to dream.
Yeah, without that foundation, everything else becomes so much harder. You're constantly in survival mode. And I can't imagine what that must be like for the kids growing up in this environment.
Yeah, that's something Rubio talks about a lot, how these kids are forced to grow up fast, to become incredibly resourceful, but at a cost.
Right, like they're learning to navigate a world that feels unpredictable and often unfair. You wonder what kind of impact that has on them long term.
Yeah, it's a heavy burden to carry at such a young age.
Absolutely. And yet, the video also captures these incredible moments of joy and community. You see kids playing, families sharing meals, supporting each other. It's like a reminder that even in the toughest circumstances, the human spirit finds a way to shine through.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it speaks to the power of community, of connection, of people coming together to support each other when the systems in place fail them.
Yeah, it's inspiring. It makes you realize that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, there's always resilience.
There is. But we also have to remember that this is happening on a massive scale. We're talking about thousands of people living in these occupied buildings across São Paulo. It really drives home the magnitude of this housing crisis, how broken the system is.
Yeah, and it's not just an isolated incident, right? It's a symptom of much larger forces at play, like income inequality, the lack of affordable housing options, a system that often prioritizes profit over people.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the numbers, but we can't forget that each one represents a human life, a story of struggle, of resilience. It's a stark reminder that everyone deserves a safe and affordable place to call home.
Totally. And right now, for a huge chunk of the population, the system is failing to deliver that.
Yeah, it's a wake-up call, a challenge to rethink our priorities, to work towards a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and watch this unfold. We have to be part of the solution.
We do. And to be part of the solution, we need to understand the nuances of this issue. Because while the occupation movement is clearly driven by desperation and a need for change, it's not without its critics.
Oh, right, for sure. Like, there are legitimate concerns about safety, legality, the impact on property rights.
Exactly. It's messy. But I think what's important is to approach it with nuance, recognizing that there are multiple perspectives here and no easy answers. We have to move beyond this black and white thinking and have honest, open conversations about the trade-offs involved.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think the occupation movement is a symptom of a much deeper problem. It's a challenge to all of us to rethink our priorities, to work towards creating a more just and equitable society where everyone has a chance to thrive.
And that brings us to the crucial question. What can we learn from this situation? What are the potential solutions, and what are the ethical considerations we need to grapple with as we move forward?
So, we've been talking about these families in Sao Paulo who are occupying abandoned buildings, desperate for a place to live.
Yeah, a pretty extreme situation.
It is. And one thing that really struck me as we were looking at all this was that constant sense of uncertainty they must live with. I mean, it's one thing to be struggling to make ends meet,
Right.
but to never know if you'll have a roof over your head tomorrow, that's got to be a whole other level of stress.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like living in this constant state of anxiety, right? Like never being able to relax, always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Exactly. It's like a psychological pressure cooker. Imagine trying to build a life, plan for the future, when eviction could come knocking at any moment.
Yeah, it's hard enough to plan for the future when things are relatively stable.
Right.
But when your whole world could be turned upside down at any moment, it's got to be incredibly difficult to even think about tomorrow, let alone next year or 5 years down the line.
I mean, think about the impact on the kids.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine being a child and not knowing if you'll be sleeping in the same place next week, next month. It's got to be really disorienting.
The article mentions how these kids kind of become really resourceful, really adaptable, almost like they have to grow up faster than kids who have more stability in their lives.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're seeing their parents struggling just to survive, so they learn to navigate a world that feels unpredictable, maybe even a little unfair.
It's like they get this crash course in resilience, whether they want it or not.
Yeah, exactly. And, you have to wonder what kind of long-term impact that has on their sense of security, on their outlook on life.
That's a really good point. Like, are they more likely to be risk averse? Or maybe more willing to take risks because they've already seen how quickly things can change?
Right. It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something to think about. And yet, despite all that, what's really incredible is how these kids still find ways to just be kids. In the video, you see them playing, making up games, forming these really strong bonds with each other. They haven't lost that spark of joy and wonder.
It's amazing, isn't it, that even in these really tough circumstances, kids are still resilient, adaptable.
Yeah.
They find a way to make the best of things.
It speaks to that kind of fundamental human need for play, for connection, for a sense of normalcy, even when the world around them feels anything but normal.
Yeah, and it's a powerful reminder that no matter how challenging things get, there's always hope. There's always this potential for joy and connection. And speaking of challenges, let's talk about the day-to-day realities of life inside these occupied buildings. Because the video really gives us a glimpse into just how difficult it is to make ends meet, even on the most basic level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these buildings are often dilapidated. They lack essential services like water, electricity, sanitation.
Right, it's not like moving into a nice little
Here,
apartment.
not at all. And you're constantly battling just to make it livable, to make it safe for your family.
And what's really striking is how resourceful these families are. They pool their resources, fix things, share tools. It's like this incredible display of collective ingenuity, figuring out solutions on the fly.
I mean, they have to, right? They don't have any other choice.
Right. But it's still amazing to see how they organize themselves. They create committees to manage different aspects of life within the building. It's like they're building their own little society within these occupied spaces.
It's like a microcosm of a larger society, right? With all its complexities and challenges. But it also highlights the power of community, how people can come together to support each other when traditional structures fail them.
It's like they're saying, we're not going to wait for someone else to fix this for us. We're going to take matters into our own hands and build something better for ourselves. And, what's really interesting is that this movement is about so much more than just finding a place to live. It's a powerful statement about who belongs in the city, who gets to benefit from its prosperity.
It's like they're reclaiming space, right?
Exactly. It's like they're saying, we're not invisible, we're here, and we deserve to be here. And it's a direct challenge to the whole narrative of a city that's so focused on progress and development, but often at the expense of its most vulnerable residents.
So it's forcing people to look at the human cost of that progress.
Exactly, and to ask themselves, what kind of city do we want to live in? Who benefits from the way things are? And who gets left behind?
Yeah, those are important questions. And it's not just about Sao Paulo, right? This is happening in cities all over the world.
Absolutely. It's a global issue, and it's only going to get more pressing as cities continue to grow and change.
So we're all kind of implicated in this in a way.
I think so. We all have a role to play in shaping the future of our cities, in ensuring that they're equitable and just for everyone. And that starts with understanding these complex issues, having these difficult conversations, and being willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
It's about looking beyond the headlines and seeing the human faces behind the statistics.
Exactly. And remembering that we're all interconnected, that our actions, our choices, have ripple effects.
So let's talk about solutions. Like, what can we actually do to address this problem?
Okay, so we've seen firsthand the struggles, the resilience, the powerful statement these families in Sao Paulo are making by occupying abandoned buildings. But it leaves us with this massive question, right? Where do we go from here? Like, what are the actual solutions, the policies, the concrete steps we can take to create a more just and equitable future, not just in Sao Paulo, but in cities all over the world grappling with similar challenges?
Yeah, it's a big question. And the first thing we need to recognize is that there's no quick fix, no magic bullet. The housing crisis is so complex, you know? It's a tangled mess of social, economic, and political factors. It's like, I don't know, trying to untangle a giant knot. You can't just pull on one thread and expect the whole thing to unravel.
So where do you even begin to untangle something like that? It feels so overwhelming, you know?
Well, you start by acknowledging that there are many different threads to pull on, many different approaches to explore, and it's really about getting everyone to the table. Policymakers, urban planners, developers, community organizers, and most importantly, the people directly affected by these issues. You need all those voices, those perspectives to find solutions that are both practical and, actually address the root causes of the problem.
Okay, so it's a multi-pronged approach. But what are some of those specific approaches we're talking about? What ideas are out there that could actually move the needle, so to speak?
Well, one that's gaining a lot of traction is social housing, which is basically government funded or subsidized housing projects specifically for low and middle income families.
Yeah.
The idea is to create housing that's not just affordable, but also high quality, integrated into the community, not just these isolated projects. And it's about involving residents in the process, making sure the design, the amenities, everything actually reflects their needs and respects their dignity.
It's not just about warehousing people. It's about creating communities, right? Places where people can thrive.
Exactly. And then another model that I find really interesting is community land trusts. These are nonprofits that own and manage land for the benefit of the community. So it helps prevent displacement, keeps neighborhoods stable, and it can even create pathways to affordable home ownership.
It's like giving the community more control over its own destiny rather than being at the mercy of these larger forces.
Yeah, exactly. It gives them agency. And then there are things like inclusionary zoning, where developers are required to set aside a certain percentage of units in new projects for affordable housing. So it ensures that new development benefits everyone, not just, the wealthy.
It's like baking in affordability from the get-go rather than trying to play catch-up later.
Right, exactly. But, and this is important, none of these are perfect solutions. What works in one city might not work in another. It's about tailoring solutions to the specific context, the needs of the community, the political realities on the ground.
So it's about experimentation, trial and error, constantly adapting to find what works.
Yeah, that's the nature of complex social problems. And, beyond specific solutions, you also have to address the deeper underlying issues.
Yeah, those root causes you were talking about.
Yeah.
Like, you can't just keep slapping Band-Aids on a gaping wound. You got to address what's causing the wound in the first place.
Exactly. And one of the biggest culprits is income inequality. I mean, the gap between the rich and the poor is just widening at an alarming rate, and that puts immense pressure on housing markets. When a tiny percentage of the population controls most of the wealth, it drives up costs, and everyone else is left scrambling.
It's like the game is rigged, The deck is stacked against those who are already struggling.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I think we also need to rethink how we approach urban development in general. Too often it's about attracting investment, catering to tourists and the wealthy, while the needs of everyday people are kind of pushed aside.
It's like building a city for everyone but the people who actually live there.
Right, and that's a recipe for the kind of social unrest and desperation we're seeing in São Paulo. We need to shift our focus toward creating cities that are inclusive, equitable, sustainable, cities that work for everyone.
Cities that are designed for people, not just profit.
Exactly.
And I think that brings us to a really important point, which is that this is a global issue. Cities all over the world are dealing with rising inequality, housing crises, people being pushed to the margins, and it can feel so overwhelming, like what can one person even do? But I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We all have a role to play.
Absolutely. And it starts with awareness, understanding the issues, challenging our own assumptions and biases. It's about being informed citizens, engaging in our communities, advocating for policies that promote affordable housing and address inequality. It's about supporting organizations doing good work on the ground, holding our elected officials accountable, and it's about just showing up for our neighbors, building relationships across social and economic divides. Real change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when people come together.
We've seen the desperation, the hardship, the systemic failures that are pushing people to these extremes, but we've also seen the incredible power of community, the resilience of the human spirit, this unwavering determination to fight for a better future.
It's like these families in São Paulo are showing us that even when faced with overwhelming challenges, it's possible to resist, to create, to imagine and build a better world, and that's a message that should give us all hope.
You really should. It's a reminder that we're all interconnected, that our actions, our choices have ripple effects. And it's a call to action, a challenge to step up and be part of the solution.
Well said.
We've covered a lot of ground today exploring a really complex and challenging issue, but this conversation is far from over. It's up to each of us to take what we've learned and turn it into action. We'll see you next time.
E vai ter as reintegração, sim. Nos outros prédios já tem 2 com reintegração. Mas essa é a forma que a gente achou, enquanto movimento de moradia, de pressionar os órgãos públicos, a ocupando.
Edilson, só vou dar instrução pro pessoal aqui. Que a gente vai abrir lá e vamos sair para poder abrir o outro prédio para a companheira nossa. Eu sem gritaria na rua, um máximo de silêncio.
Quem tem criança, por favor, as crianças, vai no carro.
Tem prédios vazios e se tiver que ocupar, a gente vai ocupar, porque o pessoal não tem para onde ir. Então se for para ocupar, a gente vai ocupar. A gente vai ocupar.
Sai!
Escora aí, faz o cordão, faz o cordão. Tem que abrir o bagulho, vai trabalhar. Bate aí, agora sim, aí. Bate. Bora. Entra aqui no fundo. Pode acender a luz agora. Tá bom. Cadê o cadeado? Tá com a chave aí? Fica a chave na responsa aí. Certo? Aê, caramba! Moleque! Eu sabia, irmão. Falei, André, corre, pega que vai dar alguma coisa errada. Vou chamar agora e reunir essa ferramenta. 5 minutos melhor.